2.4 sculpture, part 3. I think I mentioned I'm a sculptor. Now, I never have done carving, not to any real degree, but the methods that we're going to go over are some traditional and some more innovative and current, okay? All methods of sculpture basically still exist today. Lots of people do all kinds of different things or combinations of things. But we're going to break it down, and the book has a really great diagram, if you look at it in this chapter, about what kind of materials go with the various methods that you're looking at on page 251, 2.4.14, the principles of sculpture. So I'm not going to get too into that, but subtractive sculpture, just so you know, is carving. Basically, that is the two things that go together. Can't really think of anything else besides carving, but there are other ways, I suppose. But when you're removing something, you have, and it's confusing because when we were talking about color, we're talking about additive and subtractive color. Those are really different things. So don't go there thinking that's going to mean the same thing. At any rate, if you think about our block from Michelangelo back here, as we're subtracting, as we're taking away, we're revealing the sculpture itself. It can't be redone, it can't be patched back on. So you really have to know what you're doing, and you have to understand the feet, I almost said female form looking at this, which is really funny. And this is Moses with horns, by the way. I forgot to mention that. That was supposedly a mistranslation, that Moses had horns, from the Greek or from the Latin or something. I don't know. I always thought that was interesting. But anyway, to sculpt something out like that is very difficult to do. There's no do-overs. There's no way to fix it. Now, I will say, that being said, every time that I give you guys an absolute, there's always an exception, right? Well, there are ways of mixing some dust, perhaps some marble dust, with a polymer, which didn't exist back in Michelangelo's day, unfortunately. In his day, they might have mixed some plaster in with the marble and tried to kind of like paste it back on. It always kind of shows, though, and it doesn't age the same as the rest of the sculpture. So it might look good for 10 or 20 years, but after that, it kind of starts to show. In more modern methods, there are ways to patch things that are pretty seamless, that are not visible, but anyway, I digress. So additive sculpture is modeling, generally, or casting or constructing. Assembling is another good word to think of. So you're going to take stuff and you're going to put it together. So you can think about boards being hammered together, metal being welded together. Casting was a little bit different. We'll get into more detail with that. Modeling, which is usually clay or wax. So there's a couple of good videos that are posted, one of which is for your quiz. Carving is the most ancient. So you just take a sharp object to a piece of wood or stone or ivory in some cases. Ivory is softer and smaller. You usually have either walrus tusks or elephant tusks. This is banned nowadays, by the way, because it went overboard and they were killing elephants just for the ivory. So that has been banned. Sometimes you see bone carvings, left over from your rib dinner perhaps. And then you'd carve into those, and you would see some of that. But more often it was stone or wood. So chipping, carving, sanding, and polishing. So we're going to look at this particular one, 2.4.9, figure of the war god Kukaili Moku. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. I really don't actually know in this case. Beautiful piece. Reminiscent of tikis, what we think about tikis, and this could even be called a tiki if you wanted to. The style of tikis we look at usually are more Polynesian. I mean, Hawaii is part of Polynesia, but more southern, meaning Tahiti and Fiji and Tonga, different islands. But their gods are depicted with these wild faces. And if you look at the Maori, too, that's another way to look at this sort of a facial lineage here. That gets put onto tattoos and things. You'll see that repeated in Maori tattoo design. But anyway, you can see some of the marks of the chisel or the sharp object that was used to carve away some of the wood, very hard wood in this case, and then a bit of polishing or shining happening. So Hawaiian war god, and he's carved from a larger piece of wood. So back to this larger picture here, the negative space. I can't get my mouse to come on. I'm having some issues. So this negative space is carved completely away, right? Because there's enough tensile strength in wood that it's okay if it has kind of narrow pieces holding it up. In stone, that's a different story, and we're going to look at that. So Lono is symbolized in the figure's hair, originally created for King Kamehameha I, who we have some record and knowledge of. This piece is a Henry Moore piece, and this is out of stone. Henry Moore sculpture is more often cast in bronze, but this was a stone carving from 1938. Henry Moore sculptures, you'll see them in the front of many museums. I wouldn't say most, but anymore. Palm Springs Museum has one out in the front, or used to do. And they're in large sculpture gardens all over the world. But he usually does things out of bronze, highly abstracted figures. This is a female here. And this is green Horton stone. I don't know much about this particular stone, but you can kind of see all these different striations and some of the patterns in the stone coming through. But this is a carving piece, okay? Carved away. Famous piece, the Mount Rushmore National Memorial. Now this has become controversial because the land that it was on belonged to some native tribes. But at any rate, at the time it was started in 1927, we had quite a strong nationalist push. It wasn't originally intended to be presidents. It was more of a local piece. And as the project took shape and the monumental nature of it, they decided to make it for very notable presidents. We have George Washington. We have Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, who this is just after his presidency, and Lincoln. So we have the 18th century, 19th century, right into the 20th century. And you can kind of see his eyeglass lens. I think that's really wild. Of course, you couldn't put like a pane of glass up there in all that harsh weather in South Dakota. So you would just have these sort of denotations of the brass lining around his type of glasses that he wore. Very interesting piece. A lot of effort went into this sculpture. Chisels were used eventually, but initially they just blasted with dynamite some of these sections to get it to come away, because that would have been a lot of chiseling by hand. You can see what it used to look like, these pieces of stone here that are kind of rounded, and then it was all carved away. And then you can see some of the detritus, some of the carving mass, some of the chunks come away here. Huge, giant piece. Largest, most famous sculpted portraits. So Borglum is our artist here. He worked with a pretty large team, and it's our image of 4 U.S. presidents. So now we're going to get into modeling, and modeling is usually it's a malleable material. Clay or wax are our primary modeling materials. Nowadays, you can go to Michael's art supply and get something like Sculpey, or there's all kinds of other products, but basically clay is our traditional one. Clay goes back 20,000 years. It goes back a long time, and it's very easy to form and to fire into a hardened surface. And wax, which is used for casting quite frequently. In some elementary schools, kids do make little sculptures out of wax. They heat it up kind of with their fingers and get it moving. Beeswax is softer. You can do that with it, and they make these funny little sculptures. Really sweet. So there's also a skeletal structure for a support called an armature. Not always, but we'll get into that. And clay, when clay is dried or fired in a kiln, becomes hard and durable. This is an Etruscan piece. So if we think about the Romans, the classic Greek and Roman era, this is before that time. And I know it seems confusing because we only look at certain artworks in certain time frames, but a lot of stuff is overlapping in the world, and it's too much for us to get into. There's always more art history that you can study, and even beyond that, there's a PhD, and it goes on and on. Details, details, details. You can get into minute details. If you go to Rome, if you ever get that chance, there's so much to see. Of course, our Sistine Chapel, but there's also an Etruscan museum of Etruscan works only, and it is huge. Amazing. And I believe that's what this is, but my in my tourist wording, or what I was told is the Etruscan Museum, but I don't remember seeing this piece, to be honest with you. But there was a car accident that day. It's a long story, so I got a little distracted. Anyway, this is terracotta, and it's painted. We don't see much evidence of the paint anymore. We're seeing mostly just sort of the terracotta color. Terracotta, you've seen pots made out of terracotta at Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever. It's that kind of brownish clay. It's a lower firing clay. It isn't as hard or as durable as your china plate you might have at home. That's a higher fire piece. If you do have lower fire terracotta pottery, you'll see that it chips easily, and you'll notice that. But at any rate, this is modeled and sort of pressed into. There's a bit of carving that happens with clay too once it gets a little drier, but mainly we have these sort of freestanding arms that come out here and different things that are happening, because if you dry it correctly and then fire it in the kiln, it'll hold this position, and for eternity, let's say. Once you make something into ceramic, it lasts forever. So we have 4 separate pieces here that make up it. This is a sarcophagus, and the couple's relaxed and enjoying themselves at an Etruscan banquet. So for the historical aspect of this, the funerary sculpture would show engagement in activities they would be engaged in life, and that also that women had a high social status. And that's true of Roman women as well. That translates later into the culture. So casting is another way of working with material. And what it is first is it's molded into a shape like wax is one. And then it is burned out. The wax is put into plaster, burned out, the plaster remains. And then you pour the hot molten bronze into the plaster, and it captures the image of the shape. Okay, so first the model of the final sculpture is made. Now that's kind of a difficult word, but it's a model of the sculpture, and then that's used to make the mold, which is the plaster. It's got sand and some other stuff in it too, and then the casting liquid is poured inside it. When it hardens, the result is a detailed replica of the original model.